Labour and the Conservatives are heading into a general election fighting over which party will be more fiscally conservative. But they aren't the only options in town. Earlier today, I spoke to Green Party co-leader Carla, and I began by asking her what issues the Greens will be fighting the next election on.
If you want a party who will defend our future by tackling the climate emergency, protect the NHS from privatisation, stand up for renters, tackling the housing crisis with policies to create more affordable homes and give councils the power to bring in rent controls, something I've campaigned on for nearly a decade, and standing up for human rights at home and abroad, from people fleeing violence, arriving on our shores in small boats, to those suffering in places like Gaza, Sudan and Xinjiang. If you want a party that's not afraid to stand up for all those policies and not afraid to talk about taxes, recognising that the UK has a system that's rigged against those on low incomes, and that we could pay for good quality public services that benefit everyone by asking those with the broadest shoulders, the multimillionaires and billionaires, to pay a bit more, well, you can get all of those policies, and the party for you is the Green Party.
Let's talk about Gaza, because I know that many of our viewers sort of gave up on the Labour Party a while ago. But some of the ones who were holding out sort of said, it's been the Labour Party's position on Gaza, which has been our red line. We're going over to the Greens. And I suppose I want to know from you to what extent you will be highlighting Gaza as a big issue at the next general election, or is that something that you think is a bit divisive and you're going to be highlighting other things instead?
The Green Party has been really clear. Since October, we've been calling for a bilateral ceasefire, for the release of hostages, and for the suspension of arms sales to Israel while they continue to break international law. And that's consistent with our international policies regarding other countries as well. We stand up for human rights wherever and whenever. And I'm grateful to see the support that we're getting from lots of different communities across the country who share those values. And, there's been polling time after time that has shown that a huge majority of Brits, around 3/4 of Brits, share our demands for a bilateral ceasefire in Israel and Gaza and want to see the UK government do more. So, yes, I will always stand up for human rights and the rule of law internationally. And that's a key issue. But so are issues at home. And speaking to voters on the doorstep, where I'm based in my home city of Bristol and elsewhere, voters are motivated by a range of factors. As you said, there are a lot of voters who voted Labour in the 2019 general election who were already feeling pretty disillusioned by the direction that Starmer has been taking the Labour Party. And some of them cite the U-turn on their previously flagship 28 billion climate investment. Others cite the rollback on rent controls, on public ownership of public services, on standing up for workers at picket lines. And those are all areas where the Green Party's stood firm and the Labour Party has backpedaled. But you're right that I think for many voters, Gaza has been the one where previously Labour voters or even members were really hanging on by their fingernails, as one voter put it to me, giving Labour one last chance, even though they were disappointed. And Labour's failure to call for a ceasefire in a timely manner on Gaza was the straw that broke the camel's back.
If sort of Palestine becomes a key issue for the Greens, I think many people who are in the Labour Party under Corbyn won't be surprised if you get sort of charges of anti-Semitism thrown at you. And I want to show you actually a clip. It's Peter Mandelson talking just after the local election results, and I want to get your response to it.
The Green Party is becoming a dustbin, a bit of a repository, not only for climate activists, but for disgruntled hard leftists leaving the Labour Party and some fairly unpleasant hardline Free Palestine activists as well. They're all turning to the Greens. And I think whilst in the first instance the Greens look sort of bigger and emboldened, I think this is going to change the complexion of the Green Party, and I think they will rue the day when they threw open their doors to all these people.
I mean, how do you respond to that? Are you worried that you will rue the day when after throwing the door open to, as he says, all these people? And I suppose, have you thrown open the door? I mean, are you quite actively welcoming people who've left the Labour Party because they think it's gone too far to the right, or are you sort of a bit wary about that?
Firstly, I think we have to start this conversation by hopefully agreeing that anti-Semitism is completely unacceptable. It has no place in our politics or our society, neither does Islamophobia or any other form of racism. So where there have been accusations against Green Party members, we take all those instances very seriously. But our disciplinary procedures operate rightly, completely separately from the leader's office. So I don't get to control the decisions that are made there, and I wouldn't have it any other way. I wouldn't be part of a party where I did. I do think it is instructive to notice the timing of these attacks when we have just had our 5th consecutive phenomenally successful set of local election results. We have, over the last 5 local elections, increased our number of councillors by nearly 5-fold. We're now on over 800. We have representation on 174 councils, and we went into these local elections in the administration on over 10% of councils in England and Wales. We don't know the final number yet because negotiations are still ongoing in some of them, but we know it's going to be higher than that. So I think the timing of some of these accusations may indicate the motivation. But of course, where there are serious accusations, it's only right that the party looks into it. But I think the fact that the Green Party has taken a really clear stance on Gaza and on anti-Semitism and Islamophobia from the start has perhaps made us a target for some people.
One problem that Labour under Corbyn had is that they sort of never came out and sort of made this clear distinction between anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. It meant that they were often sort of firefighting. And I suppose I want to get from you sort of the sense of what kind of politics is welcome in your party. And I suppose, a controversial phrase, for example, has been "from the river to the sea, Palestine will be free." Now, from my perspective, and I think most of our viewers' perspectives, they think that's a perfectly uncontroversial phrase. Obviously, the Labour Party disagrees. Keir Starmer will also say, some pretty bad things about anti-Zionism. I suppose, are you sort of comfortable saying anti-Zionists are welcome in the Green Party?
So let's pick up that phrase "from the river to the sea" first of all. I personally don't use it because I'm aware that it upsets some people, even though I don't believe that the vast majority of people who are using it mean anything other than justice and peace for Palestinians. And I think you're right to highlight the need for a clear distinction between robust criticism of the actions of the Israeli government and anti-Semitism, which, of course, it is perfectly possible. And Jewish organisations will confirm that it's perfectly possible to robustly criticise what the Israeli government has been doing since the 7th of October, and indeed for decades before that, without being anti-Semitic. And this is something that my deputy leader, Zach Polanski, who is himself Jewish, has pointed out in a number of interviews he's done over the last few days, that if comments that criticise Israeli government policy are branded as anti-Semitic, even if they might be poorly judged statements that aren't how he would put it and that he doesn't agree with, if they're not anti-Semitic and they start all getting labelled as anti-Semitic, then that makes Zach feel less safe. Because then when there is genuine anti-Semitism, there is the risk that gets lost in the noise. So I think it is incredibly important that we are clear about the difference, and also clear about the difference between someone that may have said something that inadvertently reinforces an anti-Semitic trope because they were ignorant of what those tropes are, to someone who deliberately and maliciously promulgates anti-Jewish racism. So a proportionate response, as I say, as co-leader, I rightly don't have any input on the disciplinary process, and certainly not in any individual cases. But I can share that our approach it does take into consideration where that person is coming from. And for the vast majority of people who may have unwittingly shared an anti-Semitic trope, not understanding the impact it has, they're going to be mortified by the impact that their comments have had. They're going to want to apologise. They're going to want to educate themselves and make sure it never happens again. That's going to be, and so the Green Party wants to support those people to educate themselves and give people a chance to better themselves. I mean, I think that's how we would all want to be treated in society, and so it's the approach we want to take as a party as well. And I think that the statement you may have seen that the Jewish Greens and Muslim Greens, two liberation groups within our party, jointly put out this week that talked a lot about working together to tackle anti-Semitism, Islamophobia, and wider injustice in UK and global society. And helping people to educate themselves about these issues is so helpful and constructive for the way forward.
Let's look at other broader policy areas. So I suppose one critique that's put out of the Greens that I think has some strength to it is this idea that you're sort of talking out of two sides. So you're appealing to sort of younger people in the inner cities and you're telling them, we'll build lots of new houses. We want to speed up the green transition so it's even faster than it was already planned to be. But then you've got quite a lot of seats, especially council seats in sort of more rural areas where you're competing with Conservatives, and you end up having Green councillors who are standing on a platform to say, we don't want new solar farms, we don't want new houses, and essentially sort of in the countryside, you're a bunch of NIMBYs, and then in the inner cities, you're sort of promising this new bold future where we sort of build a lot of stuff. I mean, how do you respond to that?
I don't think that's fair, and if I may be a little bit blunt, I think you've slightly fallen for the Labour Party attack lines there. We know that's Labour's approach to criticising the Greens to try and stop us getting elected. It wasn't very successful. We've had record-breaking results. Of course, it's true that we're speaking to voters across a range of geographies and demographics, but we're not saying wildly different things to them. You would be surprised how many, say, a retired woman who owns her home outright in somewhere like Suffolk still supports rent controls because her children or grandchildren are stuck in an overpriced private rented flat with no prospect of ever buying a home because they can't save for a deposit because rents have gone up out of all proportion to incomes. I'm aware of the accusations that keep being put to me in interviews about Greens opposing things, but these are cherry-picked examples. With 800 and something councillors across 174 councils, yes, you are going to be able to find half a dozen or so examples of Greens voting against a housing development or a solar farm. But if you actually look beyond that headline, that whoever it is that doesn't want Greens to get elected has been putting around, then you'll see that there are some very good reasons in those specific cases. So one of them was a solar farm that was proposed in a nature reserve. And the Greens and councillors from other parties on the same council agreed that putting the solar farm in a nature reserve when there was other suitable land nearby that wasn't a nature reserve wasn't the best idea. And so the solar farm in the nature reserve didn't go ahead, and plans are progressing for a solar farm elsewhere. I don't think that's anti-solar farms or anti-development. I think that's common sense. And I think voters would want their councillors to make balanced decisions looking at the individual circumstances of each case.
In terms of national policy, though, so for me, the Greens' opposition to HS2 seems somewhat bizarre, right? I think if what we want is sort of a society where we can sort of continue to be prosperous but live in a more sort of green way, then high-speed rail should be exactly the kind of things that Greens are supporting. And I know you sort of say, oh, we'll invest it in sort of different forms of public transport, but this is what's being proposed. And as sort of lots of people, John Stone at The Independent, have sort of explained very well, HS2 isn't just about getting from A to B a little bit faster. It's about opening up loads of capacity. And I suppose my concern there would be that this is more about coalition management within the Greens, where you're sort of saying, well, there's some people who really don't want this railway track to go through some nice fields in the home counties. And so you've decided to have this sort of cake and eat it policy where you say, oh, we won't have HS2, don't worry, we oppose HS2, but we will have other unspecified, unnamed public transport policies. And I suppose that might be seen as a sort of characteristic example of saying, well, we want green development, but also we want to keep the NIMBYs on board.
the Green Party does support high-speed rail, and I, as an engineer, particularly support high-speed rail. It's true that the Green Party has long challenged the specific route of HS2, especially the first phase, because of the ecological damage of that particular route. It goes through a lot of old growth forest, which has a lot of environmental value. You say sort of, I think you said something like, that's the one that's on offer, but it's unfortunately the situation we're in at the moment, thanks to the government, I think is probably the worst of all worlds, in that phase 1 of HS2 has been built. That's the bit that has caused the most ecological damage because of the particular route. And yet phase 2, which was the part that was going to increase connectivity in the north of England, which is massively lacking investment in its public transport infrastructure, and we're never going to level up if we don't tackle that, has been scrapped. One of my fears with HS2 is that it risks just turning Birmingham into another commuter town of London. And if all we have is first phase of HS2, and it doesn't even go all the way to Euston, then I think my fears might be realised.
Would you actively call then for the government to recommit to phase 2 of HS2? To me, you're sort of saying it would be better to have a train which went both to Birmingham and then also to Manchester and also to Leeds and then maybe up to Scotland. So I suppose you don't want to come out and say, look, if we're going to build this leg of HS2, we should build the rest of it as well.
So speaking entirely for myself for a moment rather than for the entire Green Party, in the few months leading up to when the Conservatives pulled the plug on phase 2, I was certainly starting to think, okay, we're reaching the stage now where enough of the HS2 route is built that perhaps we should start transitioning from opposing it to holding HS2 Limited to account to make sure that it can be the best it can be. The Sunak then pulled the plug on phase 2, and our Green Party conference, which came a week or two later, passed a motion to call for an investigation into the Conservatives' mishandling of that, in particular the financial mismanagement, but also the fact that the decisions they made around the land that had been put aside for phase 2 means that they are potentially preventing any future government from picking up phase 2 if it is found to be viable in the future. So I'm not making a definitive decision here and now, not least because I don't have access to all of the detailed information. But I certainly would want to be open-minded about whether, having built the first phase, are we sure that the best outcome for the country is to leave it at that? I think it's worth looking at.
Great. So we might see a commitment to Northern Powerhouse Rail and extensions of HS2 in the Green Party manifesto. I'd personally love to see that.
Well, we certainly want to see major investment in railways, including in the north of England. And that was another concern with the way in which Sunak rolled back on the proposal for the second phase of HS2, is that there was a sort of initial vague headline promise that it would be reinvested into other transport projects. And then when the details came out, it turned out that was going to be moving that investment from rail investment into building more roads. Now, obviously, we're in a climate emergency. Building more roads probably isn't the answer. So part of that motion that passed at our conference was about making sure that investment, if it's not going into HS2, is going into investment in rail that improves capacity and connectivity, especially in the north of England.
I want to ask or finish with a question about sort of Green Party strategy. So a recent Ipsos poll showed that both you and your co-leader, Adrian Ramsey, had name recognition of only 4% of the public. I mean, that was 1% lower than a made-up politician called Stuart Lewis. And I have for a while wondered if this co-leader situation is serving you well, because as a sort of smaller party, it's going to be very difficult to get name recognition anyway. And the fact that you're then dividing your appearances between two people just makes it really quite impossible for an ordinary member of the public to know who is the leader of the Green Party. And I feel like, are you concerned that this is holding you back and you should go for a more sort of charismatic leadership model if you actually want to sort of make strides in general elections?
Of course, I would like name recognition to be higher. It certainly seems to be going quite well in Bristol, where I'm standing to be MP in Bristol Central, but I recognise that it could be a lot higher nationally. I think that's got more to do with the level of media coverage we get. So thanks for having us on. But unfortunately, we do see that outside of the last few weeks before the election, where broadcasters are by law required by the regulator to give a proportionate exposure to each of the parties, depending on their vote share, amongst other things. Outside of that regulated period, we don't get the level of opportunities in broadcast media, especially that corresponds to our level of public support by any stretch of the imagination. I mean, the Reform UK party, I don't think they've even hit double figures. I think they've got single figures numbers of councillors, 8 or something. We've got over 800. And yet the Green Party receives nothing like 100 times the amount of media coverage that Reform UK does. In fact, probably nearer the other way around. So, of course, I'll do my best in every opportunity to get my face and name out there. But I don't think that our model of co-leadership, which makes political roles more accessible to a more diverse selection of people, is the thing that's at fault here. So our candidates can stand for solo leader positions if they want. It's not that our constitution requires co-leaders. People can stand either solo or as a job share pair. But the advantage of job sharing is it makes it more accessible to people that have caring responsibilities, maybe have disabilities or long-term health conditions that mean that they have so many skills to bring, but wouldn't be able to do the job full time. And that's long been an inclusivity principle of the Greens. Back in 2015, 2 women stood as job share MP candidates, and they were disallowed. And they actually took the appeal to the High Court to try and make a point that preventing people from doing this, in this case, it was because one of them had caring responsibilities for a disabled child and the other one had a disability herself. They would have been fantastic MPs, but neither of them would have been able to do the unsociable hours that the current role of MP demands. So I think it's very much an asset that the Green Party is willing to be flexible to allow a wider demographic of people to take part in politics.